How would you like to drown in a 15-foot tsunami of beer? Sound tasty? Well, Londoners had the chance to find out in 1814, and I can't help feeling kinda jealous. You may think it's absolutely insane of me to say this, but at this particular time and place, there was such a thing as too much beer. If Oliver Twist was there and he could ask for more, he definitely wouldn't have. This is one of the crazier historical disasters ever to grace the mean streets of Napoleonic-era Britain. Actually, it's one of the craziest historical disasters to show up anywhere in any era of human history, and it involves a fair amount of corporate malfeasance and shirking of accountability because, of course, only poor people died, so who cares? The Great London Beer Flood. Delicious or deadly? Let's find out. As the age of sail began to draw to a close and Napoleon was beginning to eat it hard on the high seas, Britain's big 74s with their 36-pounder cannons were bashing the shit out of the French and its client fleets and sinking them into the drink. Against the backdrop of all this chaos and brutality of the Napoleonic Wars, a massive ongoing international conflict involving close to 50 countries and territories, London was thirsty.
Yes, we drank beer. I liked beer. Still like beer.
The cool thing about London's beer scene at the time is that the most popular drink in the city was porter. Porters originated in London in the 18th century, and it's possible that they were named after the vocation they were most popular with when they first appeared on the scene. If you're an IPA drinking frat bro who's never had one before and you just can't get that Jaeger bomb out of your mouth long enough to sip on some to try it out, a porter is among the most delicious beers in existence. Yeah, that's my personal opinion, but in this case, it also has some major historical backing behind it. Porter is a dark and creamy beer similar to a stout, usually brewed with ale yeast and chock full of malty chocolate and hearty caramel notes. Spawning from the Industrial Revolution, porters are one of the first beers that were brewed specifically to taste good. Most beer up until then was simply manufactured based on cost efficiency and availability of ingredients, and nobody aged beer before it was sold back then like we do now, so the complexity of flavors and alcohol content wasn't up to the standards it can be today. For example, a regular pint of beer in the Napoleonic era would have been about 1 to maybe 3% alcohol by volume, whereas today the standard is 5%, but that can go all the way up to a whopping 75%. Turns out there are lots of breweries really pushing the threshold of safety and sanity when it comes to extreme brews, like this one that for some reason is wrapped in a dead squirrel. Of course, that's not normal, and most beer doesn't get above the low double digits. But porter was the first ever beer that was made to meet actual, real customer demands. Real live people liked it, as opposed to the disgusting pea water and IPAs they had at the time. Yeah, I said that. IPAs are disgusting. They were made that way because they had to be, because refrigeration didn't exist. Deal with it. Either way, just imagine living in a time when you could finally get plastered on something you genuinely wanted to drink. The porter marked the beginning of this utopian era and the age of good beer. What I have here is the porter from Founders Brewing Company. It has a creamy texture and tastes baking chocolatey with a deep-bodied chewiness with notes of roasted sugar, coffee, a balanced hop flavor that doesn't overtake the overall profile. It's an exceptionally drinkable brew for those of you who can put your IPAs down for 5 seconds and try something good. One of the most popular and largest producers of porter in London was the Horseshoe Brewery, which was located at the corner of Great Russell Street and Tottenham Court Road. Today, it's the site of the Art Deco Dominion Theatre. Back in 1764, when it opened, the brewery was named after the Horseshoe Public House. Public house being where the term pub would originate. Public house meant that bars back then were really just houses that you lived in public with all your wasted friends. If you ever needed a cool new way to look at it and you wanted to bring something back out of history now that everything's terrible, I think we could start with that. The Horseshoe Pub was established all the way back in 1623 and named for the shape of its dining room. The brewery was the 11th largest producer of porter in the city, putting out 40,279 barrels every year. The porter at the Horseshoe matured for months at a time and even up to a year for the very best varieties. In 1809, Henry Meux, a partner at one of London's largest breweries, Meux Reed of the Griffin Brewery in Clerkenwell, bought the Horseshoe Brewery and incorporated it into the Henry Meux & Co. brand identity. Henry's father Richard was also a brewer, and the success of Meux & Co. would launch a family dynasty of beer magnates and socialites that would extend into nobility and members of parliament. They were so stupid rich by the third generation that they built one of the first roller skating rinks called Rinkomania, and they even saved London's Temple Bar Gate when the city wanted to widen the street, but obviously didn't want to destroy a monument with a 500-year history. So the Meux family just bought that thing, paid to disassemble it and reassemble it at their own estate, Theobald's house, where it stood all the way up until 2005. 2004. You can go to Theobald's Park and see a little plaque there now. All right, rewind back to 1814. Under Henry Meux's tenure, the Horseshoe Brewery grew in size and stature and became the 6th largest producer of porter in London, putting out 103,502 barrels every year. So what I'm telling you is there was a massive amount of creamy liquid gold housed inside this brewery, poised to find its way into the waiting mouths of the British people whether they liked it or not. And on one particular night, all that porter did escape, and it would go on to acquire a bloodlust that would devour the streets of London and cement itself into the collection of the wildest historical footnotes of all time. On October 17th, 1814, almost exactly 8 months prior to the Battle of Waterloo, where Napoleon would get pooped on for the last time, disaster would strike. It all began when brewery storehouse clerk George Crick casually observed that one of the porter barrels was in need of a little maintenance. But these weren't just any barrels. Henry Meux had specially designed massive 22-foot wooden vats to mature his porter. These things were the size of houses. They were legitimate tourist attractions. Each of them held 18,000 imperial pounds of porter, which is not in freedom units, so it's hard to tell, but it sounds like a lot. These gigantic barrels were held together with the help of enormous iron hoops that weighed 700 pounds each. That's 2.7 Dwayne "The Rock" Johnsons each band. And the slats of these vats were secured by multiple bands each. So every now and then, one of these big iron hoops would slip out of position a little bit. This happened at least a few times a year, so Crick didn't panic or think much of it at all. It wasn't the end of the world, or at least it hadn't been thus far. He simply followed protocol and began drafting a note to have the barrel repaired. Crick's supervisor instructed him to write his note to Mr. Young, who was a partner at the brewery, so that Mr. Young could kickstart the repair on the iron band that had lost its way. At around 4:40 p.m., Crick was holding the very note in his hand while standing on a platform some 30 feet away from the damaged vat when the whole thing suddenly broke apart. At this point, Crick was like, "Oh, this was not like in the job description." And he knew he wasn't nearly thirsty enough to drink thousands of pounds of beer by himself in order to save the citizens of London. He'd be way over the limit, and he definitely wouldn't be able to drive his carriage home, or maybe his Zeppelin. I'm not fully sure how he got to work in the morning. But one exploding house-sized vat of beer doesn't just keep to itself, and the dangerous physics of the whole thing would reveal itself to Crick in sinister slow motion as he stood helplessly by and watched the slats of another barrel begin to give way. The pressure of the absolute volcanic explosion of beer pouring out of these vats initiated a chain reaction, and combined with a bit of corrosion on these gigantic iron bands, more and more barrels burst apart at the seams, and there was nothing Crick could do except basically wait to die. All right, this is where our tale of historical disaster gets really shitty. Behind the brewery was an area called the St Giles Rookery. A rookery was a word in the common vernacular of the day that was used to describe a slum. This was where the absolute dregs of society lived. It housed all the pores that nobody else wanted to look at, and that London could push into dingy basements stacked deep with multiple families each. An English preacher of the time called it a rendezvous of the scum of society, which is always a nice religiously minded thing to say about people. The word rookery came from a description of the nests of birds from the crow family called rooks, which are found throughout Europe. I looked around a bit and I didn't see any of these in America. I mean, I looked out the window and I didn't see any birds sitting on power lines sipping tea, so I think we're safe from all that noise. Rookeries were said to be like the nests of these birds, just loud and chaotic and best to be avoided at all costs. They were famously filled to the brim with crime, brothels, hard drinking, and general merriment of a sort that was taken just a bit too far and engaged in a bit too enthusiastically because life basically kind of sucked there. The English painter William Hogarth depicted St. Giles in some of his work, and the area was likely the inspiration for his 1751 print Gin Lane. The slum was home to city denizens on the lowest economic rungs of the ladder. These were people who were desperate to go to war to fight Napoleon because there was simply no way out of the destitute lifestyle they'd face otherwise. British redcoats are often portrayed a certain way in popular media and movies, but in reality, they were people like from St. Giles and elsewhere. Poor, uneducated, often criminals, and willing to be paid absolute garbage in order to have the remotest shot in life, even risking death while doing it. Redcoats were paid less than unskilled laborers of the time. It was awful work, but apparently somehow less awful than to live in the St. Giles Rookery. Because on top of everything else, the Irish lived in St. Giles too, which was just taking things too far for a lot of the civilized English folks of the day. You take your potatoes and your Lucky Charms and you stay in the basement, they told the Irish, you magically delicious motherfucker. The St Giles Rookery sat along the rear of the Horseshoe Brewery in a cul-de-sac. A massive wall 2 bricks thick was the only thing separating rows and rows of 2-story beer vats from the streets and subterranean dwellings of the residents of the slum. And you'd think that would be enough, but against a wave made of an estimated 1 million liters of beer, the wall stood absolutely no chance. And neither did the residents of the St Giles Rookery. The housing here was run down, decrepit, and rooms were generally death traps, especially since a lot of them were basement dwellings below the ground level. 2.5 million pints of beer ran out into a 15-foot tsunami into the rookery. The wave annihilated the first 2 houses it touched, just completely turned them to rubble. Another 2 houses were critically damaged but still somehow standing by the end. The first victim of the London beer flood was 4-year-old Hannah Bamfield. She was having tea with her mother and another child in the very first house that was destroyed. Somehow, the rush of beer swept the other 2 out of the house altogether, but Hannah was tragically trapped in the rubble before the structure came down. Even beyond tragically, in the second house that was destroyed, a downtrodden Irish family was gathered while having a wake for a 2-year-old boy. The boy's mother, Anne Seville, was killed when the beer collapsed the walls, along with 4 others, including a 3-year-old boy. The others killed were Mary Mulvey, the mother of the 3-year-old, Elizabeth Smith, and Catherine Butler, who were all lost in the debris. 14-year-old Elena Cooper worked for the Tavistock Arms in Great Russell Street, and she was washing pots in the pub's yard at the time of the accident. Eleanor likely didn't even have time to react when the Horseshoe Brewery's massive brick wall collapsed, falling on her and crushing her beneath the rubble. The topography of St. Giles was flat, and there were a lot of basements, so there was nowhere for this massive lake of beer to go except into people's homes. There were multiple reports of terrified people climbing onto furniture to escape certain death by drowning in the 7,600 barrels worth of porter that had suddenly and violently cascaded into the slum. As for brewery clerk, oh my god, brewery clerk. As for brewery clerk George Crick, he ended up walking away from the whole thing just fine. In fact, no one from the brewery itself was killed, though 3 workers had to be pulled from the rubble after the wall collapsed. No word on whether or not they were seriously harmed. There were reports after the accident of drunken crazies sprinting through the streets and filling up buckets and whatever they could grab in order to save as much beer as they could. Some people lapped up the beer with their hands, and they got so drunk that one person actually died of alcohol poisoning. Of course, these reports are totally untrue, and there's no evidence at all that any of that happened, and everyone is trying especially hard to be quiet so that they could hear the cries for help beneath the rubble and save their friends and family. But again, most of these people were poor and Irish, so there was loads of unfavorable shit talk coming at them from all directions at every opportunity, even from mainstream publications. Of course, the physical damage to the brewery itself was immense. It was such a catastrophic sight that watchmen at the brewery charged people to come take a look at the mess. The initial beer explosion and subsequent beer cano and beeral wind took out support beams and more walls, and the building was basically sawdust when it was all said and done. 23,000 pounds worth of damage was the final tally on the brewery alone. So the government took all their assets and sued them to fix the neighborhood and pay restitution to the families of those injured and killed. I'm just kidding. The Meux family was stupid rich, so they came out on top in the end. Coroner's inquest, along with the jury, declared the whole thing an unavoidable act of God, which is now a phrase I'm going to be using from now on anytime I do something undeniably stupid and clearly my fault, which is often. The brewery came away with a nice chunk of insurance money, and in addition was granted a sin tax refund from Parliament. That major rush of cold hard cash saved it from bankruptcy. Yay! Sin taxes, by the way, are excise taxes that are applied to certain goods and services like alcohol, tobacco products, and gambling that have an element of social harm associated with them, and they're paid at the time of purchase. Sin taxes are designed to discourage people from buying these things, especially lower income demographics who don't have the disposable doll hairs to just toss into the devil's furnace. Advocates say that these specific items and activities taxed are things that create harm, and that harm overflows unfairly throughout society at large, placing a burden on people not engaging with the specific risks to eventually deal with the consequences of those who do, like covering the rising healthcare costs of smokers versus the general population. As far as I can tell, it does seem to work. For example, after implementing a sin tax on alcohol in Maryland, car crashes among drivers in the state aged 15 to 34 went down by 12%. If you don't know what an excise tax is, those are taxes paid to the resident country of the business when it makes a sale of certain goods or services. A drawback then happens when those goods are unable to be used, in this case, since the porter was destroyed. Taxes. I'm gonna drink until I can't see taxes anymore. Look, I went through the dismal torture of reading all about excise taxes and excise drawback for you, and sure, while also pounding these, but you just better appreciate it anyway. The only type of consequences you could come away with possibly having happen to the brewery was that they kind of quietly phased out those gigantic wooden aging vats. In fact, though, that happened across the entire industry afterward, and then they were replaced by concrete-lined containers. As for the relatives and families of the victims of the beer flood, along with the residents of the houses that were damaged, well, they got absolutely nothing from the government or the brewery at all. Some of them resorted to putting the bodies of their loved ones on display and charging visitors to see them in order to come away with any kind of restitution at all. In one horrific aftershock moment, so many visitors were present at one of the houses while visiting the bodies that the floor collapsed and they all fell into the basement below, which was still filled to the brim with the porter from the beer flood. I do wonder if they had to pay extra for the interactive version of the experience. The mourners from the wake who died in the flood were given their own wake at the Ship Public House on Bainbridge Street. The other bodies were laid out in a nearby yard by their families where the public came by to pay their respects, and also where collections were taken up so that money could be given to the families. So there, it's not just 21st century America where people have to crowdfund for their own healthcare emergencies and funeral expenses. Take that, Regency-era British poors. The Horseshoe Brewery operated at the same location up until 1921, at which point they were so flush with cash that they moved to a bigger facility. In 1961, the brewery was liquidated and acquired by Allied Breweries. The Dominion Theater was then built on the site of the original brewery when it moved in 1921, and the theater is still there to this day. The beer didn't fully drain away from St. Giles for several weeks. The smell was absolutely overpowering. If you've ever been to one bar that's older than just a couple of years, think about that waftable stale beer scent multiplied by a factor of 1,000,000 and permeating the entire city of London and the surrounding area for months. Now today we have these fun things called corporate negligence laws. Negligence occurs where there is no intent to harm, as opposed to committing a purposeful act or one with established motive. These laws are in place to protect people from the very possibility of an unavoidable act of God, which I don't think that the beer flood was entirely anyway, but let's not split hairy barrels of porter over it. And if a giant flood of delicious creamy beer took out a socioeconomically distressed neighborhood inside a modern nation, I'd like to think that there would be significant consequences. But who knows? I'd guess the giant beverage conglomerates that own most every brewery these days would get a slap on the wrist and a token fine that they've already budgeted for 1,000,000 times over, and then give their executive team huge bonuses and call it a day. We can, of course, try to demand better of our public safety pillars and hold corporate interests accountable. That takes an engaged and informed populace with the motivation to take action and participate in civic responsibilities like voting and supporting sane candidates and a stable government that wants to regulate the unchecked power of freewheeling executive psychopaths. With the power vested in me by the sanctity of the spirit of the lingering beer smell, some say, still watches over the city of London to this day, I bequeath you with the ability to go forth and prevent these kinds of unjust accidents and their repercussions going forward. I know we can do better with our collective willpower to protect our fellow citizens, especially the most vulnerable among us. Let's get together on these issues. Let's do some fucking good about weird historical disasters. Cheers.
Yes, we drank beer.
It's also really mild and drinkable. It's not like,
Yes, we drank beer. I liked beer. Still like beer.
And subsequent beer Kano and beerwind.
We drank beer and we drank beer.
What?
We drank beer. We liked beer.
You freaky.